In this video I shall look at the testimony of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus at Nuremberg on the 11th of February 1946. He had been called by the prosecution and, up until that time, had been in various Soviet POW camps following his capture on the 31st of January 1943 at Stalingrad, which I have described in a separate video. Whilst in captivity, he did speak to German communist Wilhelm Pieck, who had worked in Moscow for the German language propaganda station Radio Moscow since the beginning of the invasion, and who in 1943 had been one of the initiators of the National Committee for a Free Germany, an organisation made up of Germans prepared to collaborate with the Soviet Union. Pieck visited the officers in order to talk to them about it. Paulus was happy to talk to him, unlike most of the officers who showed Pieck nothing but contempt. In this conversation he admitted his disappointment with Hitler, but insisted that as a soldier he had to obey under all circumstances. He thus firmly refused to contribute to the founding of the committee. He had also refused to join the League of German Officers, the BDO, which was founded on the 11th or 12th of September 1943 by 95 German officers in the Lunyovo prisoner of war camp near Moscow. The aim of the organization was to cooperate with the Soviet Union in order to preserve the German Reich after its anticipated defeat. It was led by General of Artillery Walter von Seydlitz-Kosbach. It called upon German soldiers to defect and fight against the Hitler dictatorship through leaflets and radio broadcasts. It might have influenced some German soldiers to surrender or work with the Soviets. However, it did very little to persuade Stalin. It soon merged with the National Committee for a Free Germany. Paulus eventually did agree to join the anti-Hitler bloc after the 20th of July 1944 coup against Hitler. He used the rather weak excuse that the final straw for him was the severing of diplomatic relations between Germany and Turkey, which would lead to an Allied landing in the Balkans, he thought, thus rendering the war lost for Germany. On the 8th of August 1944, he signed an appeal to the German people calling on them to renounce Hitler. As a result of this, his family was taken into custody. His wife, daughter and daughter's son, born in 1942, were sent to Dachau concentration camp, while his son was imprisoned in the Immenstadt fortress in southwestern Bavaria in the Allgäu region. When the war ended, he told his NKVD handlers that he was prepared to give evidence at a future trial. In this video I'll cover the testimony of Paulus in its entirety. It might seem as though I'm jumping around a bit and not covering the answers in chronological order. In this case I am following the order of the questions and answers as they happened at Nuremberg. You can of course listen to the original recording of the testimony of Paulus on the YouTube channel of the Robert H. Jackson Center.
Taken in German. Yes. Yeah. Will you repeat this oath after me? I swear by God,
Ich schwöre bei Gott,
the Almighty and Omniscient,
dem Allmächtigen und Allwissenden,
that I will speak the pure truth
dass ich die reine Wahrheit sagen
and will withhold and add nothing.
dass ich nichts verschweigen und nichts hinzusetzen werde.
Would you like to sit down?
Paulus stated that on the 3rd of September 1940 he'd come to the High Command of the Army, the OKH, as Chief Quartermaster 1. At that time, the Commander-in-Chief of the Army was Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, and the Chief of the General Staff was Generaloberst Franz Halder. As Chief Quartermaster 1, Paulus acted as deputy to the Chief of the General Staff, supervising certain cases on Halder's behalf and carrying out the tasks assigned to him. In this capacity, he was especially charged with adapting the operational plan which later became known as Barbarossa. When he arrived on the 3rd of September 1940, he found an unfinished plan of operations against the Soviet Union, based on documents that had been worked on by Major General Marx for approximately 2 to 3 weeks. These documents, handed to Marx and then to Paulus by Halder, became the basis for the future development of the plan, and what was eventually executed corresponded to these foundations. Paulus explained that orders concerning military measures came from the High Command of the Wehrmacht, the OKW. He referred to Führer Directive No. 21, which was Operation Barbarossa, which he knew as an example of such an order. That directive was signed by Adolf Hitler and, as far as he could remember, initialed by Keitel and Jodl. In general, most directives were signed by Hitler. Sometimes they were signed by others in his name. From this, he concluded that the man who gave the orders was the supreme commander of the Wehrmacht, Hitler himself. He thought that responsibility for such directives lay with those who were Hitler's first military advisors in the OKW. The General Staff of the Army, with its large machinery, had the task of working out in detail the idea conceived by Hitler and transmitted through the Supreme Command. In Paulus's view, the General Staff had to pass on the orders of the Supreme Command to the appropriate departments. There was close cooperation between the Supreme Command and all persons charged with carrying out the Supreme Commander's orders. The detailed completion of the Barbarossa plan was presented either by the Chief of the General Staff or by the Commander-in-Chief of the Army. Hitler then accepted or rejected it. In the end, the plan had to be accepted or refused by him. Paulus emphasized that preparation of the Barbarossa operational study was a theoretical preparation for an attack on the Soviet Union. The order to carry out this theoretical work on the conditions of an attack was considered by him and all other informed experts as the first step in preparing for an aggressive war against the Soviet Union. From the way in which the task was initiated, it became apparent that practical application would follow the theoretical preparation. He stated that no intelligence reports from the Abwehr had been received which indicated preparations or intentions on the part of the Soviet Union to attack Germany. These matters were discussed within the circle of the Army General Staff, and there were serious misgivings, but no reports of visible Soviet preparations for the war were brought to his knowledge. He considered the plan as an attack, and the indications did not exclude the conclusion that it was a straightforward offensive initiative. Paulus explained that the order for this theoretical study and its development were regarded by himself and by other experts as the first step towards the preparation of an aggressive war against the Soviet Union. He didn't know in what form von Brauchitsch, the Commander-in-Chief of the Army, may have protested to Hitler, if at all. As for himself, he couldn't remember having spoken to von Brauchitsch about his doubts, but he did speak to the Chief of the General Staff, Halder, who was his direct superior. Halder, he said, shared his opinion and felt great anxiety about the plan for many reasons, both military and moral. When asked about his own responsibility, Paulus initially requested to be relieved of answering questions that concerned his personal conduct, explaining that he believed he had been called as a witness to events which formed the basis of the charges against the defendants, and that questions directed against himself went beyond that. The tribunal, however, ruled that he had to answer the questions put to him up to that point. Paulus confirmed that he later became Commander-in-Chief of the 6th Army. At the time, he accepted that command and led the army towards Stalingrad. He had already had serious doubts and recognized that preparatory work pointed towards an aggressive attack on the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, he accepted command and later held Stalingrad. He explained that in the situation then prevailing for a soldier, and in the atmosphere of intense propaganda, he believed, as did many others, that he had to do his duty towards his fatherland. He emphasized that his later description of the war as a criminal attack was the result of developments and reflections that came after his experience as commander of the 6th Army, culminating at Stalingrad. At the time he took command, he said, he didn't see the entire extent of the crime inherent in the planning and execution of this war of aggression and could not see it. His knowledge then only covered part of the whole. He distinguished between his knowledge at the time and later judgment. He stated that he realized later, through his experiences and subsequent consideration, that the attack on the Soviet Union was a criminal war of aggression. He knew already at the time of planning that such an attack would violate international law, in particular the treaty with Russia, which had existed since the autumn of 1939. He was aware that an attack could only be carried out in violation of that treaty. However, he did not, at the time, foresee the subsequent conditions and developments that later characterized the war as he came to understand it. He explained that, from the attitude prevailing among a large part of the officer corps, he knew that his was an act of aggression, but within the prevailing concept of the time, he didn't see anything unusual in basing the fate of a people and a nation upon power politics. He did not share the later tendencies of the regime, but he did not, at that time, reject the notion that power politics could be the basis of a state's decisions. Looking back, he considered it was a mistake to think that in the 20th century only democracies and the principle of nationality should be decisive while accepting power politics as normal. He granted, in good faith, that others who are not so close to the sources as he had been might likewise have believed that they were acting in the best interests of their fatherland. Paulus was confronted with a written declaration he'd made on the 9th of January 1946 in a Soviet POW camp. In that letter to the Soviet government, dealing with questions arising within the Sixth Army in Russia and aspects of his personal experience, he'd stated, "Today, when the crimes of Hitler and his helpers are being judged, I find myself obliged to tell the Soviet government everything which I've known and which may serve as proof of the guilt of the war criminals in the Nuremberg Trials." He confirmed having written this, but pointed out that the letter was concerned with matters relating to Stalingrad, the Russian civilian population, and Russian prisoners of war, and that it was not meant as a general political analysis or a list of named individuals in the Hitler government. He explained that when he spoke of the Hitler government, he meant the Hitlerite leadership of the state. Everyone who bore responsibility, including the Reich cabinet, insofar as it was the responsible for the directives issued by the government. He stressed that in his testimony he had confined himself to describing what he'd seen and experienced personally and had not attempted to pass judgment on the individual personalities in the government, because that went beyond his knowledge. He didn't know whether specific cabinet members such as Funk or von Schirach knew of Hitler's plans. He also didn't know whether the Reich cabinet actually held meetings during the war. He was not aware that Hitler, for reasons of secrecy, might have ordered that civilian cabinet ministers be excluded from conferences between himself and military advisors, or that Hitler had forbidden the presence of such civilians at military conferences. He stated simply that he knew nothing about such arrangements. On the subject of telegrams sent from the encircled Stalingrad fortress to Hitler, Paulus stated that he knew only of the last telegram. In that final message, there was a brief description of what the army had accomplished and its achievements. It was emphasized that the army did not intend to capitulate and that this stance was an example for the future. He explained that in the desperate situation at the time, attempts were made to find a meaning in the catastrophe by depicting the suffering and dying of so many soldiers as heroism that would be remembered forever. He admitted that, given the circumstances, he'd allowed such a depiction to pass and had not stopped it. He didn't know to which earlier telegrams of devotion his interrogator referred, messages said to promise to hold out to the last man and which had shocked the German population, and he requested that any such documents be shown to him, as he knew nothing about them beyond the last telegram. He acknowledged that he was promoted to General Field Marshal at Stalingrad, and that he continued to bear that title, as shown by his signature on the statement submitted to the court. He explained that he'd had to take the title conferred upon him. He denied sending any telegram of thanks or other messages to Hitler after his promotion and stated categorically that he had not thanked the Führer in any way, despite contrary statements made by others. Paulus was then confronted with the concluding sentence of his detailed letter to the Soviet government, in which he wrote, "I bear responsibility for the fact that I didn't give due attention to the execution of the order of the 14th of January 1943 about the surrender of the prisoners, namely all Russian prisoners, to the Russians, and therefore I didn't devote myself sufficiently to the taking care of prisoners," meaning the Russian prisoners of war. In that same detailed letter, he'd not mentioned the several 100,000 German soldiers under his command who lost their freedom, health, or lives. Paulus admitted that the letter contained no reference to his own soldiers and explained that this was not the purpose of that document. The letter, he said, was concerned exclusively with the fate of the Russian civilian population in the Stalingrad area and with Russian prisoners of war, and at that time it was not possible for him to speak about the fate of his own soldiers that he believed would have to deal with it at a different time. He stated that the operational orders which led to the terrible conditions at Stalingrad had been issued despite his objections. Around the 20th of January 1943, he had reported that conditions in the Sixth Army, owing to cold, hunger and epidemics, had reached a degree of misery and suffering that was unbearable, and that continuation of the fight would exceed human possibility. The answer from the Supreme Command was, "Capitulation is impossible. The Sixth Army will do its historic duty by fighting to the utmost in order to make the reconstruction of the Eastern Front possible." Paulus admitted that he continued his efforts under this order until the very end, even though he would later call the entire undertaking a crime. He repeated that he had not recognized the entire criminal character of the war from the outset, but only later, as a result of his experiences at Stalingrad and subsequent reflection. The discussion then turned back to the planning phase. Paulus explained that while one could initially have assumed that the operational study against Russia was merely a theoretical plan for an eventual case, very soon as the work progressed, developments made it seem that these theoretical preparations were intended for practical execution. In connection with drafting this plan, which from the beginning envisaged using the Romanian area, he had observed the dispatch of a first German military mission with training groups and an entire panzer division to exactly that area. This practical measure in the zone he was theoretically planning to use strengthened the impression that the plan would indeed be carried out. He was reminded of Hitler's Directive No. 18 of the 12th of November 1940, which stated in paragraph 5, Russia, political conferences with the aim of clarifying the attitude of Russia for the near future have been started. After seeing this passage, he was told that it might indicate that the decision to attack the Soviet Union must have been taken later than the autumn of 1940. Paulus replied that from his personal experience and his retrospective view of the entire development, he could only say that there had been a clear sequence. The conception of the plan on the 3rd of September 1940, the directive of the 21st December 1940, and then its execution. He could not specify at what exact date the final decision had been taken. He was not in a position to determine that. Paulus knew only that Soviet forces had marched into Poland in 1939. He had no information about the size of these forces or whether they had been considered disproportionately large by German military experts. He did know that before German deployment on the eastern border, strong Soviet forces, including powerful tank formations in the region of Białystok, had been already placed opposite the German frontier. He had no knowledge of whether German divisions transferred from west to east came only after large Soviet concentrations were in place. About the practical execution of troop movements from west to east, he knew nothing. In April and May 1941, when many such movements occurred, he had been absent from the High Command for long periods on other duties. He recalled that, At the end of March 1941, there had been a conference at the Reich Chancellery where Halder had given reasons for a planned attack on Yugoslavia. Paulus stated that he'd been told that the purposes included eliminating a threat to the flank, securing use of the railway line to Niš, and keeping the right flank free in the event of an attack against the Soviet Union. He also knew that the initial reason for planning operations in the Balkans was to relieve the Italians and to make possible operations against Greece. The danger existed that Yugoslavia and Greece might cooperate, enabling Britain to land forces on the Greek coast and thereby gain access to the Romanian oil fields. Paulus thus regarded the operations against Greece and Yugoslavia after the Yugoslav coup reversed an earlier agreement with Germany as necessary preliminary steps. The revolution in Yugoslavia, which followed the conclusion of an agreement granting Germany use of the railway line from Belgrade to Niš, had created a new political situation. He saw no contradiction between the decision to attack Yugoslavia, despite its inconvenient timing, and the desire to carry out Barbarossa. The attack on Yugoslavia had postponed Barbarossa, originally planned for the middle of May 1941, weather permitting, but was, in his eyes, a prerequisite for its execution. Regarding his position and duties of the High Command, Paulus stated that the theoretical operational study against Russia had initially been his task as Chief Quartermaster 1. However, in December 1940, the Operations Department of the Army took over the work. When he was Chief Quartermaster 1, he did not command the Operations Department. That department remained directly under the Chief of the General Staff. Paulus's responsibilities lay in running the training section and later, from autumn 1941, the organizational department. Thus, the making of proposals for ongoing or future operations did not fall within his sphere of authority. He merely carried out specific tasks that were assigned to him. When asked about the strength of German forces in the East in September 1940, Paulus stated that he no longer knew how many divisions were there for border protection. This was shortly after the French campaign, and although he knew the general situation, he couldn't give precise figures. When asked about the strength of German forces in the East in September 1940, Paulus stated that he no longer knew how many divisions there were for border protection. This was shortly after the French campaign, and though he knew the general situation, he couldn't give precise figures. For February 1941, transports to the east began. He likewise could not state the strength or deployment of Soviet forces along the German-Russian demarcation line and the Romanian-Soviet border. The information reaching the German side about Soviet forces was, he recalled, extraordinarily scarce and incomplete. For a long time, they had no clear picture of the enemy's strength. He acknowledged that Halder, in his position, could have spoken frequently with Hitler about Soviet strength and deployment, but Paulus himself could not remember any such discussions in detail, particularly since, after December, he no longer dealt with those questions. During theoretical war exercises in early December, he and others based their planning on assumptions regarding enemy strength rather than solid intelligence. He contrasted his own limited view, confined to the part necessary for his specific work, with that of General Jodl at the OKW. Jodl, as Chief of the Wehrmacht Operations Staff, had an overview of the entire situation, whereas Paulus, confined to his role at the Army High Command, saw only his own sector. He confirmed that both his work and Jodl's were General Staff preparations for war, but from different vantage points. On the order forbidding capitulation at Stalingrad, Paulus stated that the responsible authority was the Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht, the OKW. Whether any particular individual, Keitel or Jodl, had participated personally in issuing it, he didn't know. The responsibility rested with the office itself, which was represented by those persons. He added that at that time it had been represented to him that the fate of the German people would be decided by the armies holding out at Stalingrad, and this was an important reason why he didn't attempt to break out in defiance of Hitler's order. Paulus had heard rumours in the late summer, early autumn 1942 that changes in the leadership were being considered. According to a rumour conveyed to him by the Chief of Staff of the Luftwaffe, Hitler was displeased with Jodl and was planning a change there. There was talk of Paulus possibly replacing Jodl as Chief of the Wehrmacht Operations Staff if the Stalingrad operation were successful, or of Paulus as being relieved of command of the 6th Army to lead a new army group. None of these possibilities were ever officially communicated to him. After his capture, Paulus became a prisoner of war in Soviet hands. He denied ever having taught at the military academy in Moscow or holding any position outside POW camps. He stated that he'd been in POW camps like other captured German soldiers. He was asked whether he had become a member of the Committee for a Free Germany. He replied that he had become a member of a movement of German men, soldiers of all ranks and men from all classes, who aimed at warning the German people at the last moment from the abyss and inciting them to overthrow the Hitler regime, which had brought misery to many nations and above all to the German people. In this context, he participated in issuing a proclamation on the 8th of August 1944. Before that date, he'd taken no such action. He explained that this movement had at its disposal the means of making itself heard by the German people through radio and newspapers created amongst the prisoners of war. It felt it was its duty to inform the German population of the military situation, of the events of the 20th of July 1944, and of the convictions gained through experience. The initiative for such propaganda came predominantly from the ranks of the 6th Army. The participants had experienced at Stalingrad how, through orders from the military and political leaders against whom they were now taking a stand, soldiers had died of hunger, cold and snow, and how the horrors of a war of conquest had been concentrated in that one place. This experience inspired their later opposition to the Hitler regime. Paulus stated that, apart from propaganda activity, the movement had no other means at its disposal. He had not placed his military experience at the disposal of any other authority, and he denied being used in any other practical way. The tribunal intervened several times to restrict questioning. It ruled that questions about the treatment of German prisoners of war in the Soviet Union were not relevant, either to the issues of the trial or to the credibility of the witness, and therefore would not be allowed. Similarly, questions concerning the internal structure of the Nazi Party political leadership and the precise extent of knowledge among political leaders was limited. Similarly, questions concerning the internal structure of the Nazi Party political leadership and the precise extent of knowledge among political leaders were limited, on the ground that Paulus had no knowledge of these matters. Paulus admitted that he didn't understand the party's internal organization and that he couldn't say what party officials or political leaders at various levels knew about aggression or plans for war. He stated that during his command of the 6th Army, he had no SS divisions under his command, either during normal operations or later in the Stalingrad pocket, where he had 20 German infantry, armoured and motorised divisions and 2 Romanian divisions. He had never heard of SA units as military formations, though SS units were known to him. He also had no Gestapo detachments attached to his army. Questioned about the structure and role of the General Staff, Paulus described it as a technical executive body charged with carrying out existing instructions. In practice, he said, it functioned as an advisory organization to the Supreme Command of the Army and not as a policy-making authority. It had the task of realizing directives issued by the Supreme Leadership, and it carried out those orders absolutely. He was aware that certain differences of opinions had existed between the General Staff and the Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht. He knew that his immediate superior, Halder, had frequently disagreed with the Supreme Command, though Paulus couldn't detail these conflicts. Political questions in the narrower sense were generally not discussed in the circles of the Army High Command. When asked more broadly whether officers who disagreed with the regime's policy of war planning and aggression could remain in the General Staff, Paulus observed that political questions in this broader sense were not formally the subject of discussion in his environment, and that he had no evidence of officers being removed solely for such disagreements. On the question of planning the future of occupied Soviet territories, Paulus said he didn't know detailed political plans. His knowledge was limited to what was contained in the so-called Green Folder, which concerned the economic exploitation of the country. He understood the exploitation to mean using the resources of the occupied territories to bring the war in the West to a close and to secure future German dominance in Europe. He remembered that certain instructions had been issued regulating the conduct of the war in the East. He believed that a principal decree, probably in the Green Folder, and perhaps additional orders stipulated that no particular consideration was to be shown to the population and that all measures were to be based solely on military necessity. Since he commanded an army in Russia for only 3/4 of a year and was captured in January 1943, he had only limited personal impressions of the practical implementation of these policies. Finally, in response to questions from the tribunal, Paulus repeated that his military observations relevant to planning for war against the Soviet Union began on the 3rd of September 1940 and continued until January 1942, when he left his post at the High Command of the Army. He had no direct knowledge of the way decisions of the Reich government as a whole were made, or of any long-term war plans that might have been conceived before he entered the High Command. As to Hitler's methods of decision-making, he could only state that in theory he expected the government of a state to act as a unified group, bearing responsibility towards its people and capable of restraining even an autocratic leader. In the German case, however, he didn't know which ministers, if any, had been included in Hitler's inner circle when aggressive plans were made, or to what extent they had prior knowledge of such decisions. Throughout his testimony, Paulus consistently described the General Staff as an instrument of execution, acknowledged his own role in preparing and implementing the Barbarossa Plan, recognized with hindsight the aggressive and criminal character of the war against the Soviet Union, and accepted responsibility for his failure to act earlier, while stressing the limited perspective and mindset under which he and many others had acted at the time. Thus ended the testimony of Paulus at Nuremberg. He certainly had hoped to see his wife whilst he was in Germany, but this wish was not granted to him for reasons of expediency, as it was explained at the time. He was rushed back to the Soviet Union, where he was to stay for more than 7 years until allowed to leave for East Germany. In the meantime, his wife died in 1949, aged 60. He lived in Dresden as from 1953 in some degree of luxury for East Germany. He had a villa in an attractive neighbourhood, and he was given a West German car, an Opel Kadett. From the very latest, at the beginning of 1956, he started to suffer from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. This leads to muscle paralysis despite complete mental clarity. Due to his rapidly deteriorating health, a study on the Battle of Stalingrad, which he'd been working on, remained unfinished. Paulus died in the late afternoon of the 1st of February 1957 at his villa in Dresden. He was buried with military honours in the Tolkevitz Municipal Cemetery. His urn was later removed to the family grave at the main cemetery in Baden. Thank you very much for listening. Hope you found it interesting. Now, I've done accounts of various people at the Nuremberg trials, both defendants and witnesses, such as Paulus here. I upload every Friday and every Tuesday with a documentary video, and on other days I do short form videos which are up to 3 minutes in length. I upload every day, thus at 2000 hours my time, that's Central European time, so that's an hour earlier in the United Kingdom, for example, and various times in other places. I also have the possibility of membership of this channel. Membership costs £5 or €6 or $6, and that will now give you access to over 800 videos Most of them are much shorter than this one, but there are one or two of this length as well. But for the moment, thanks and all the best from me. Bye for now.